So the Victorian government's finally negotiated the passage of its Pandemic Powers Bill through the State Legislative Council, or Upper House, after former Labor MP Adam Somyurek came out of nowhere at the last minute and, possibly for the first time in his political career, decided to employ principles. Made for very satisfying viewing. It meant the government also no longer had the numbers to pass its utterly insane Health and Wellbeing Act amendments, which would have given Daniel Andrews and the Health Minister the ability to rule Victoria by executive order for an unlimited amount of time, including breaching their own Equal Opportunity Act to discriminate against specific groups of people and even arrest them without charge or trial. And despite all the Premier's claims that they were based on the approach taken in New South Wales and New Zealand, they would have been some of the most extreme and all-encompassing emergency powers anywhere in the Western world, with zero recourse from Parliament, zero independent oversight, and zero limits to how long this COVID thing can actually be declared a pandemic. But thanks to crazy and crazy brave maverick Adam Somyurek, Andrews had to go back to the drawing board, as his little deal with the three once respected crossbench MLCs was no longer going to cut it. Enter Rod Barton, MLC for the Transport Matters Party, a party so minor he might as well be an independent. He spent several days negotiating some pretty important amendments to the bill, and what's been passed is still, in my view, a pretty extreme form of executive government, and one that's never been necessary if the government would just pass its laws through the Parliament like a normal government. But Rod Barton has extracted some critical changes that the other independents like Fiona Patten and Andy Meddick did not even attempt. Instead, they just sold out in exchange for some random legislative support on other issues, which in turn makes them an utterly worthless check on a government like the Andrews government. But let's go over some of Rod Barton's amendments to the bill. Before, an Upper House Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee had the ability to review and disallow pandemic orders, a committee the government chairs and controls. Complete waste of time. They're never going to even think about disallowing something coming out of Daniel Andrews. After, establish a new joint committee, the Pandemic Declaration Accountability and Oversight Committee, which would be chaired by a non-government MP and would have a majority of members who are not from the government to make recommendations about health orders. That's an excellent change. If you've got one politician giving executive orders, you have to have a role for the Parliament in reviewing those orders, or the whole meaning of parliamentary democracy is shredded. I don't think it has the ability to disallow orders on its own, but it does have the ability to put significant official pressure on anyone playing a dictator. Before, health directions could be disallowed on the advice of the aforementioned government-controlled committee if supported by a majority joint sitting of both the Legislative Assembly and Legislative Council. Again, might as well not be in the bill. Total waste of time. Never going to happen. But after, health directions could be disallowed on the advice of the PDAOC if supported by that majority joint sitting of both Assembly and Council. So the new committee can recommend certain pandemic orders be disallowed and then call a joint sitting of both houses, which is important, but given the government of the day pretty much always has a majority in the lower house, this is also all but certain to never actually happen. Nonetheless, if you think the protests are out of control now, imagine if the government of the day used its numbers in Parliament to shore up pandemic orders that the Parliament's own committee has declared out of order. It'd be wild, and it would bolster the already prevalent claims of an authoritarian premier with little to no respect for the limits of government. Before, no review of the pandemic legislation if passed. After, the pandemic-specific legislation would need to be reviewed independently by health and law experts beginning 18 months after the laws commence and reporting after 2 years. So while this review is important, the absurdly long time frame on this basically ensures that any negatives coming out of such review are just so far down the track that most people will have forgotten about this all by then. There'll be no negative reviews in time for the next election, and these laws will just fade into the books as we get used to the many rules and regulations governing the way we live coming out of one single politician instead of a representative government. Before, If a detention review officer, which is again just a public servant the government knows will support its own diktats, recommended a person should not be detained, their recommendation to the chief health officer was not binding. But after, a detention appeal panel makes binding decisions within 72 hours of an appeal application after taking advice from the chief health officer. This is huge. While it's still a role best suited to the courts, one of the biggest used to Victorians in the original bill was the ability to detain anyone, anywhere, at any time without charge or trial and for an unlimited amount of time. All in the name of health and safety, mind you. But regardless of whether or not you think those powers are important or likely to have been abused, the fact is it flips eons of Western norms and criminal justice rights on their head. And it's the sort of thing that would have been applied to people like close contacts and even protesters. Barton's changes here are a massive win for individuals faced with the excessive use of force either by the police or by the government's authorised health officers. Big tick here, Barton. Before, no reference to the Ombudsman's ability to investigate complaints. After, clarifies complaints about detention orders can be investigated by the Ombudsman. Parliament or a committee can also refer matters to the Ombudsman. Look, it's good to have some recourse, but all the Ombudsman will be able to do in the face of these complaints is make public comments, and they don't have the ability to undo those orders or sanction the government in any way. So this is kind of just transparency for show. Before, the bill included aggravated offences, which could land a person in jail for up to 2 years in rare circumstances. So you say age. If they knew or ought to have known that a failure to comply with health directions will cause serious risks to the health of others. The offence could also carry a maximum fine of $45,435 after being halved in earlier amendments. That's down from $90,000. Aggravated offences have been removed from the bill, and breaches of the bill no longer carry a prison term. However, fines for failing to comply can still attract a $10,904 fine. Now, honestly, quite apart from the fact that fines in this state are the highest of anywhere in Australia, and the fact that an $11,000 fine would quite simply destroy most people, how did we allow our government to become so big and broad that aggravated health offences are even a thing? Aggravated health offences, which I imagine could include breathing in the presence of others, or refusing a vaccine, or protesting. I can almost guarantee you that these laws will be used to blur the line between public health protection and the right to express political dissent, just like the state of emergency was earlier last year, with incitement on Facebook becoming a jailable offence for the first time. There's no First Amendment here, which is why no government of any stripe should have powers this extensive. But that's not the Victoria we live in. We love government, and if you include government-funded building contracts, more than half of the working adults in this state are on the government's payroll. The median public service salary is $95,000, so go rub that in the face of your local charcoal chicken owner. We love being told what to do. It provides comfortable boundaries beyond which we don't have to take risks, and gives us very clear guidelines on who to direct our spite and judgment and anger towards in society. This bill is not, as Fiona Patten puts it, a good bill made better by politicians who aren't her actually exercising their principles, but it is a massive improvement on what Daniel Andrews kept secret for 8 months and then sprung on the Victorian public at the last minute. So well done, Rod Barton. Well done. Cheers.